Looking back, I never should have taken that exit off the interstate. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a quicker way home after a tiring business trip. My name is Samantha Lewis. I'm a 28-year-old marketing manager from Chicago. After finalizing a major deal, all I wanted was to get home to my fiancé, Mark. We were in the midst of planning our wedding, and the stress was piling up. Mark had always been supportive and patient, even when my job demanded most of my time. But I could tell that lately, he had been feeling a little sidelined, and I wanted nothing more than to make it up to him. It was the evening of September 14th, 2023, when I took an unfamiliar exit in rural Illinois. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle began to patter on my windshield. I thought a scenic detour would be a nice change of pace, a way to clear my head before getting back to the chaos of wedding planning. The exit led me down a narrow, winding road flanked by dense woods. A sign, barely visible through the mist, read, Hollow Creek. The town appeared suddenly, like a mirage materializing out of the fog. Old brick buildings lined the empty streets, their windows dark and lifeless. The air smelled of rain and something metallic, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed the car as I drove down the main street, noticing that every shop was open, lights on, doors ajar, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I parked in front of a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. My stomach rumbled, and I figured I could grab something to eat and maybe ask for directions back to the interstate. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. The place was empty, the booth spotless, and the smell of fresh coffee hung in the air. I moved toward the counter, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. That's when I saw it. A handwritten note lying on the counter, the words scrawled hastily, "Don't trust them." A chill ran through me and I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the counter. But there was nothing, just silence. I grabbed the note, my fingers trembling slightly, and stuffed it into my pocket. I needed to get out of there. As I headed back to my car, the radio suddenly crackled to life, a distorted voice breaking through the static. "Samantha Lewis, age 28, marketing manager from Chicago," the voice drawled, slow and deliberate. "Finalized a major deal today. Engaged to Mark Davis. Wedding date still unconfirmed." My heart pounded in my chest. How did they know all of this? I frantically twisted the dial, trying to change the station, but the voice continued, growing louder, more invasive. "Secrets she hasn't told anyone," it hissed, and I could hear my own breath quicken in panic. I turned the radio off completely, the silence almost deafening in comparison. I needed to leave. Now. I shoved the key into the ignition and started the car, my hands shaking. Just as I was about to pull away, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A man wearing a sheriff's uniform was approaching the car. I rolled down my window slightly as he reached me. "Ma'am, everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes, they never quite met mine. Something about his demeanor was off, the way he avoided direct eye contact, the way his smile seemed forced, almost practiced. I was just leaving," I stammered. He nodded slowly as if considering my words. "You sure you want to be driving out there alone? Not safe this time of night," he said, his tone shifting, a hint of something darker beneath the surface. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I muttered an excuse, rolled up my window and hit the gas. The tires screeched as I sped down the empty street, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The sheriff stood there watching, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the mist. I drove, taking turn after turn, desperate to find my way back to the interstate. But every road led me back to Hollow Creek. The town seemed to pull me in no matter which direction I chose. The same buildings, the same empty streets, looping endlessly. My chest tightened as panic set in, the realization dawning on me that I was trapped. A flashback hit me, an argument with Mark just a week before. He had wanted to postpone the wedding, give us more time to focus on each other. But I had refused. I was too caught up in my career, too afraid to let go of the one thing I felt I could control. His voice echoed in my mind, his plea for me to be present, to choose us over work. Another memory surfaced, my father packing his bags, leaving without a word. I was 10 years old, hiding behind the doorframe, watching him walk away. The fear of being left behind, of being alone, had haunted me ever since. I snapped back to the present, the car skidding to a halt in front of the diner once again. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't do this. I couldn't let this place take me. I stepped out of the car, the air thick with tension, and marched toward the diner. The sheriff was there, standing by the door, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the empty buildings. He tilted his head, a smile curling at the edges of his lips. "The town," he said slowly, "feeds on regrets, on fears. It traps those who carry too much of them." I felt a weight in my pocket. The locket Mark had given me, a symbol of our commitment. I pulled it out, the metal warm against my palm. I closed my eyes, focusing on Mark, on the love we shared, the future we had dreamed of together. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. A warmth spread through me, and when I opened my eyes, the sheriff was gone. The town was fading, the buildings dissolving into mist. I stumbled back to my car, the world around me blurring, spinning, until everything went dark. I woke up to the sound of cars rushing by, the sun peeking over the horizon. I was on the side of the interstate, my head resting against the steering wheel. My phone buzzed, and I saw several missed calls from Mark. I let out a shaky breath and dialed his number. He answered on the first ring, his voice filled with concern. "Samantha, are you okay? I've been worried sick." "I'm fine," I whispered, tears welling up. "I'm coming home." "I'm glad you decided to come home," he said softly, his words echoing strangely in my mind. I glanced at the passenger seat, and there it was, the locket, open, a photo of me, alone. My heart sank as the truth hit me. Mark had never existed. He was a coping mechanism, a figment of my imagination, created to fill the void left by my father. I had been running from my loneliness, burying myself in work, in a life that felt purposeful but empty. And now I had to face it, face myself, without the comfort of a fabricated love. The road ahead was long, but it was real, and for the first time, I was ready to take it, alone. Story 2. I still remember that crisp evening in late October when everything changed. Back then, life was a predictable routine, and I found comfort in the familiar streets of my hometown, Cedar Grove. My name is Alex Thompson. I'm a 32-year-old freelance photographer living in this small town, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. I had just started dating Emily, a brilliant graphic designer I met at a local art exhibit. We often explored the countryside together, capturing moments and landscapes with our cameras. She had this adventurous spirit that pushed me beyond the safe confines I had grown used to, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was truly living again. One crisp October afternoon, Emily and I decided to take a drive after a photo shoot out by the lake. We had spent the day surrounded by the beauty of fall, our cameras clicking away at the golden hues of the trees. On our way back, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Emily suggested we take a different route she had found on a map app. She said it was supposed to offer some beautiful scenic views, something off the beaten path. I hesitated. There was something unsettling about straying from the familiar, but Emily's enthusiasm was infectious, and I gave in. We turned onto Route 12, and soon we found ourselves in front of an old gas station, its paint peeling and its sign swaying slightly in the breeze. I remember the strange symbol on the side of the building, a series of stones arranged in a spiral. I made a mental note of it, but didn't give it much thought at the time. The road narrowed as we continued, eventually turning into a winding path that seemed to snake its way into the depths of the forest. The tall pines on either side seemed to loom closer, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. As we drove deeper, we came upon an unmarked fork. I glanced at the GPS, but the screen showed no signal. Emily was eager to continue, insisting we take the left path. I swallowed my unease and followed her suggestion. The road twisted and turned, leading us past what looked like abandoned houses. The buildings were dark, but every so often we'd see a flicker of light inside. A chill crept up my spine. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, as if they were watching us. The car's engine sputtered suddenly, and the entire vehicle shuddered before dying completely. I frowned at the dashboard. The fuel gauge read empty, even though I was sure we had half a tank when we left. Emily and I exchanged worried glances. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Emily tried hers, with the same result. The woods were eerily silent, except for the faint rustle of leaves. I stepped out of the car to check the engine, and as I looked up, I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and still, watching us. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, and it was gone. A memory flashed in my mind. My younger brother, Daniel, running ahead of me during our last hike together. The memory of that day was like a knife twisting in my chest. I had lost him in these woods years ago, and we had never found him. The thought of being lost again, with Emily beside me, made my stomach churn. Emily, sensing my fear, told me about a childhood memory of getting separated from her parents in a crowded fair. She spoke of the sheer panic she felt as a child, the fear of never seeing her family again. It was her way of reassuring me, I think, to let me know that I wasn't alone in my fear. But her words only deepened my anxiety. With no other options, we decided to walk back to the last landmark we remembered. The old gas station. The forest around us seemed to thicken, the trees pressing closer as we trudged along. No matter how far we walked, we kept ending up in the same clearing, a small circular patch of earth with a peculiar stone formation in the center. The stones were arranged in a spiral, just like the symbol I'd seen at the gas station. I stared at the stones, my mind racing. There had to be a connection. I knelt down, rearranging the stones, trying to replicate the pattern I remembered from the gas station wall. Emily watched silently, her face pale in the fading light. As I moved the final stone, a strange sensation washed over me, like a wave of warmth, followed by a sudden, deafening silence. I blinked, and suddenly we were back on the main road. The car was there, the engine idling as if nothing had happened. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a sense of relief washing over me. I turned to Emily, ready to laugh about the bizarre experience, but the seat beside me was empty. Panic surged through me. I called out her name, my voice cracking, but there was no answer. I looked down at my camera, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the photos we'd taken that day. Every picture showed only me, standing by the lake, smiling in front of the old gas station, walking along the winding road. Emily wasn't in any of them. A cold realization settled over me. She was never there. Emily, the laughter, the warmth, the sense of adventure. She had been nothing more than a figment of my mind, a creation born out of my longing, my grief after losing Daniel. The signs had been there all along, the one-sided conversations, the way no one else seemed to notice her. I sat there, the engine humming softly, the forest around me dark and silent. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, and I was alone, just as I had always been. Story 3. They say some trails are better left unexplored. I learned this the hard way during what was supposed to be a simple weekend hike. I'm Jason Miller, a 35-year-old software engineer from Seattle. After my recent divorce from Laura, I sought solace in nature. My best friend Mike thought a hiking trip might be exactly what I needed to clear my head, and suggested a weekend getaway. Mike had always been the adventurous type, eager to push boundaries, explore the unknown, and get me out of my comfort zone. And truth be told, I needed that more than anything. It was early June 2021 when we set out for the dense forests of Olympic National Park. The air was damp, filled with the scent of moss and fresh rain. The sky was overcast, casting a soft, diffused light through the thick canopy above. We planned to hike to a less traveled area near Crescent Lake. a place Mike had heard about from some local hikers. He promised hidden waterfalls and untouched beauty, a perfect distraction. Things started out well enough. The trail was beautiful, the forest lush and vibrant. I could almost feel the tension of the past year slowly melting away. Laura and I had ended things amicably, but the weight of the failure still hung over me, and I had thrown myself into work as a way to cope. Out here, though, it was just the trees, the birds, and Mike's easygoing laughter. It was the first time in months that I didn't feel completely alone. After a couple of hours on the main trail, Mike suggested we take a detour. He pointed to an unmarked path, barely visible through the thick underbrush. "Come on, man. The real adventure starts where the map ends," he said with a grin. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to stick to the known paths, but Mike was already forging ahead, and I didn't want to be left behind. We followed the unmarked trail, the ground beneath us becoming more uneven, the forest thicker. Strange carvings began to appear on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. Stones were arranged in deliberate patterns along the path, and a sense of unease settled over me. I tried to brush it off, but something about the forest felt different now. Darker, more oppressive. Mike, ever the optimist, was unfazed. He was a few steps ahead, talking about the hidden waterfall we were supposedly heading towards. I lagged behind, my eyes scanning the trees, the shadows seeming to shift and move. And then, just like that, Mike was gone. "Mike?" I called out, my voice echoing through the forest. There was no answer. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding as I reached the spot where I had last seen him. Nothing. No sign of him. No sound. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Panic began to set in. I called his name again, louder this time, but the only response was the distant echo of my own voice. Suddenly I heard it, a whisper, soft and indistinct, coming from deeper in the woods. It was my name. "Jason." The voice was familiar, painfully so. It sounded like Laura. My blood ran cold as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, taunting me, reminding me of every argument, every moment of doubt that had led to the end of our marriage. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The sun was beginning to set, and darkness crept in around me. My flashlight flickered as I made my way through the dense forest, the path seeming to twist and turn in ways that made no sense. I stumbled upon a campsite, one that looked eerily familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was identical to ours, but aged, abandoned. The tents were torn, the fire pit cold and overgrown. It was like looking at a ghost of our camp, a vision of something long forgotten. Flashbacks hit me in waves. I remembered the bitter arguments with Laura, the way we had drifted apart, the nights spent alone on the couch, each of us too proud or too hurt to bridge the growing distance. I remembered being a child, lost in a crowded mall, the panic of being separated from my parents, the fear that I would never be found. That same fear gripped me now, raw and visceral. I pressed on, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to find Mike. I had to get out of here. As I climbed a steep incline, I spotted something near the edge of a cliff. Mike's backpack. My heart sank. I approached slowly, my hands trembling as I picked it up. There was no sign of him, no tracks, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. I was alone. I sat down, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I pulled out my compass, a gift from Laura years ago, back when we still believed in forever. I stared at it, the needle wavering before finally settling on a direction. I knew what I had to do. I had to let go of the guilt, the regret, the fear that had been holding me captive. I had to find my way back, not just to the trail, but to myself. I stood, taking a deep breath, and started to retrace my steps. The forest seemed to shift around me, the path slowly becoming clearer. I walked through the night, guided by the faint glow of the compass, until finally, as dawn broke, I stumbled out of the woods and onto a gravel road. A park ranger's truck pulled up, the ranger jumping out and rushing over to me. "We've been looking for you for 3 days," he said, his voice filled with relief. "Are you all right?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He helped me into the truck, handing me a bottle of water. As I drank, I glanced at my phone, flipping through the photos I had taken. Every picture showed only me, standing by the trailhead, smiling at the camera, alone. There was no sign of Mike, no trace of him anywhere. "Who were you with?" the ranger asked as he drove. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. The memories were hazy, fragmented. Mike had always been there, hadn't he? My best friend since childhood, always by my side. But as I sat there, the truth began to unravel. Mike was an imaginary friend, a companion I had created as a child, someone to fill the void left by absent parents, by a life that often felt too empty. He had come back when I needed him most, when the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole. But now, it was time to let go. To face the world on my own, without the crutch of a fabricated friend. The forest was behind me, the road ahead long and winding, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to walk it, alone. Story 4. If only I'd ignored that flashing vacancy sign on Route 66, maybe I'd sleep peacefully at night. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I'm a 30-year-old traveling nurse. After a grueling shift in Albuquerque, I was on my way to Phoenix to visit my boyfriend, Daniel. We hadn't seen each other in weeks, our conflicting schedules making it nearly impossible to find time together. Daniel worked as a chef in Phoenix, and despite our best efforts, the distance and our demanding jobs had started to put a strain on our relationship. It was late on May 5th, 2023, and exhaustion was settling into my bones as I drove. The road was dark, stretching endlessly under the desert sky, and when I saw the neon vacancy sign flashing at the Desert Inn, I decided it was better to stop for the night than risk falling asleep at the wheel. The motel had a retro vibe, a single-story building with peeling paint and flickering neon. The air smelled like sagebrush and distant rain, a storm rolling in from the horizon. The receptionist was odd, to say the least. He spoke in a monotone, barely looking up as he handed me a real key. Not a key card, but an actual, old-fashioned key. His eyes were distant, his smile forced, as if he were following some script. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the late hour, and made my way to my room at the end of the row. The room was basic. A bed, a small TV, a nightstand. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to do anything else. That's when I noticed the diary. It was lying on the nightstand, the cover worn and faded. My name was written on the first page, Elena Rodriguez. I frowned, flipping through the entries. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the events described, they were things I didn't remember doing. Yet they felt eerily familiar. Trips I hadn't taken, conversations I hadn't had, yet somehow it was as if I should have remembered them. A chill ran through me, and I closed the diary, shoving it into the drawer. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that it was just some strange prank, but the unease settled deep, refusing to leave. Later, I stepped out to get some air. The other guests were strange. They stood outside their rooms, staring, their eyes following me as I walked. I tried to smile, to wave, but they just watched, their expressions blank. When one of them spoke, it was in riddles, words that made no sense. "The road circles back," one of them whispered as I passed. "No one leaves until they're ready." I hurried back to my room, my heart pounding. I decided I needed to leave, immediately. I packed my bag, grabbed the key, and went to the door. But it wouldn't open. The lock wouldn't budge, the key turning uselessly in my hand. Panic set in, and I ran to the window, only to find that the view outside had changed. It wasn't the parking lot anymore. Instead, I saw a dense forest, dark and unending, stretching out where the desert should have been. My reflection in the window caught my eye, and I froze. It was me, but not. The reflection moved differently, its eyes locking onto mine. a smile spreading across its face. It mouthed words I couldn't hear, then spoke, its voice a whisper inside my head. "You belong here, Elena. Stop running." Memories flashed before me, missed dates with Daniel, the disappointment in his voice when I canceled yet another visit. I saw my grandmother, her face stern as she warned me about losing myself in my work, about forgetting what truly mattered. The reflection laughed softly, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. I turned away, my heart racing. I had to get out. I stormed down the hallway to the front desk, slamming my hand on the bell. The receptionist appeared, his expression unchanged, his eyes still distant. "Let me out," I demanded, my voice trembling. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking, his tone flat. "The motel is for those who are lost," he said. "It gives them a place to stay, forever, until they find themselves." I shook my head, tears welling up. "I don't want to stay. I need to get to Phoenix. I need to see Daniel." The receptionist's gaze shifted, almost pitying. "Then find your way, Elena. Make amends. Only then can you leave." I clutched the locket around my neck, a gift from Daniel, a reminder of what we were fighting for. I closed my eyes, focusing on him, on the life we wanted, the future we were building together. I wasn't ready to lose it. Not yet. When I opened my eyes, the receptionist was gone. The front desk was empty, the motel silent. I stumbled back to my room, the door now open, the desert night visible through the window. I grabbed my bag and ran, not stopping until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life. I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing, my head resting against the steering wheel. The sun was rising, the desert bathed in soft morning light. I blinked, disoriented, as I answered the call. It was Daniel, his voice filled with concern. "Elena, are you okay? You didn't call last night. I was worried." "I'm fine," I whispered, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I'm coming to see you." "I'm glad," he said, his voice soft. "I've missed you." As we talked, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel was gone. There was nothing but open desert behind me, no sign of the desert inn. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. I put the car in drive, ready to leave it all behind. But as I glanced at the passenger seat, my heart skipped a beat. The diary was there, its cover worn and faded, my name still scrawled on the first page. It wasn't a dream. And somehow, I knew the motel and its secrets would always be with me, a reminder of what I almost lost. Story 5. Every town has that one road everyone warns you about. For me, that was Raven Road, a place I foolishly ventured down one fateful night. I'm Marcus Lee, a 40-year-old history teacher in the quiet town of Willow Creek. After my recent separation from my wife, Angela, I found myself spending most evenings alone, grading papers in the silence of my empty home. My colleague and close friend Sarah had been trying to get me out of my slump, suggesting I take a drive to clear my head. She meant well, but I doubt even she would have suggested Raven Road if she'd known what lay ahead. It was November 13th, 2022, a foggy, cold night. I drove aimlessly, the dense mist wrapping around my car, muffling the world outside. The GPS on my phone kept rerouting me, insisting that Raven Road was the quickest way back to town, despite my attempts to avoid it. The stories I had heard over the years, the whispers of strange occurrences, of people disappearing, of ghostly figures, all came flooding back as I reluctantly took the turn. The road was narrow, lined with ancient oaks whose branches twisted together overhead, forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow the car. The air smelled of damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, a lonely, haunting sound that seemed to echo forever. I tried to focus on the road, on the rhythmic thud of the tires over the cracked asphalt, but unease settled in my gut. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, a woman in white standing in the middle of the road. My heart lurched, and I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. I jumped out, my breath clouding in the cold night air, but she was gone. The road was empty, the fog thickening around me. I blinked, my heart pounding. Had I imagined it? I got back in the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I needed to get out of there. But as I started driving again, something caught my eye. An old manor house, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. It stood on a hill just off the road, a place I knew shouldn't exist. There were no houses on Raven Road, at least none that anyone had ever seen before. Against my better judgment, I felt drawn to it. I pulled over, cutting the engine, and made my way up the overgrown path. The manor loomed over me, its windows dark, its front door slightly ajar. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, the smell of mildew and decay filling my nostrils. The walls were lined with portraits, faces that seemed oddly familiar, their eyes following me as I moved through the dimly lit hall. One portrait made me stop. It was me, or someone who looked just like me, dressed in clothes from another century. My throat tightened as I stared at the painting, a sense of dread washing over me. Whispers filled the air, soft, indistinct, and I turned, seeing shadows flickering at the edge of my vision. I heard voices, conversations echoing through the halls, a family arguing, a man pleading for forgiveness. The voices mirrored my own troubles, my own mistakes with Angela, the nights I had neglected her, the times I had chosen work over her, all played back to me in a twisted symphony of regret. I tried to leave, but every door I opened led me back to the same room, the same portrait, the same whispers. Each time I returned, more of the manor seemed to change. The walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, the whispers louder. I was trapped in a loop, each iteration revealing more of my past, more of the moments I wished I could forget. Flashbacks hit me like a punch to the gut. Angela's face, her smile fading as I turned away from her yet again to grade papers, her voice breaking as she told me she couldn't do it anymore. And then there were the good times, the laughter, the warmth, the love we had shared before everything fell apart. I sank to my knees, the weight of it all crushing me. A figure appeared before me, a spectral version of myself, older, worn, eyes filled with sorrow. He looked at me, his voice a hollow echo. "This is your future, Marcus. A life of regret, a life alone, unless you change." I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. I had to face it, all of it. The mistakes, the regrets, the choices that had led me here. I had to let go of the past if I ever wanted a chance at a future. I took a deep breath, focusing on Angela's smile, on the love we once had, on the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. When I opened my eyes, the manor was gone. I was back in my car, parked on the side of the road, the fog lifting as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. My phone buzzed, pulling me back to reality. It was Sarah, reminding me of our planned coffee date, a date I had completely forgotten about. I smiled, a sense of clarity washing over me. It wasn't too late, I could still change. I started the car, turning back towards town, ready to take the first step forward. But as I glanced at my phone, my stomach dropped. The GPS still showed Raven Road as my current location, the line on the map looping endlessly. I shook my head, refusing to let the fear take hold again. I was getting out of here, one way or another, or